Hey, welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at more complex JSON objects. And as we saw in the example where we were looking at the random user, this is a fairly complex object. It's got a lot of people listed in here. In fact, there's actually 50 results.
This video is brought to you by Appy Academy.
And notice as well that the structure of the items that are contained within the results, there's a good similar structure to each result, and the naming conventions are all the same. So it's essentially makes it really easy to loop through them, and you know which name values are that you're able to pull back by the names. And when you are completing and creating more complex structures, you have to always ensure that if you want to be able to loop through them properly, that the structure is the same. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to create a brand new JSON file, and then we're going to pull that into our project. So we can call this JSON file test1 and save it. And I'm going to be updating this more in the format where we've got multiple friends in a list and then pulling that information back into our web project. So let's update this, and this is going to be an object that's going to contain an array of items. And with arrays, the arrays are going to have a number of items in there, and these are all going to be objects as well. So that's going to be the structure. I can just clean that up a little bit so it's a little bit easier to read. So going back into our project, and let's update this to be, and then we'll just update this to see the full JSON data that's being returned back. So refresh. And we see that within the JSON that's being returned, that's what's contained within there. We've got an array that's in there. And within the array, there's one item within the array, and this is an object. So from what we know with arrays, they're very easy to loop through. And as long as we keep the structure the same, first, last, and counter, then we're going to be easily able to access the data. So taking that structure, and usually the way I do it is I do copy it and then simply pasting it once again. So now I'm going to have two friends within that array, and I can update the names of these friends as long as I'm keeping the structure the same, which is crucial to being able to output it properly. So these JSON objects can obviously get fairly complex because of all the different data types, and you can have multiple levels all the way down. So you could have an array, and then within this array we've got an object, and then within this object we can have another array, we can have another object in there, and it could go multiple levels deep. But for the purposes of this lesson, we're going to try to keep things as simple as possible. So we'll only add in 3 different friends within the friends array. And I'll update so that they do have different values. And save. And that means that we can easily access and output them. So once we can select them, that means that we can loop through them and output the contents. And this can all be done with JavaScript because, again, JavaScript is already turning it into a JavaScript object. If you are using XHR and you're fetching it, it might be returned back as a string. And in that case, then you need to use the JSON parse in order to turn it back into a usable object format. But in this case, because it is JSON and we are using fetch, it's easily already being updated and transferred into the JavaScript object. So let's create a function in JavaScript, and we'll call this function output. It'll take in a value of data, and I'll use the output function whenever the data gets returned. And we should see nothing changed within the output because now we're outputting the console message of data down within the function of output. So we can also loop through the contents. So using the for each, so taking data, and friends is the array that's contained within the data object, and this is the one that we can loop through. And with every array we do have a default length value, so you can use that in order to create the array. And then using for each, we'll extract out the value of each one of those and then use it within the console. And each one of these values is just going to be the returned object of each one of those items contained within that array. So when I refresh it, I get each one of these being output. And because my structure is the same, it's going to be really easy to select first from each one of those, last from each one, and so on. So now when I refresh, I get the first, last, first, last, first, last coming from the JSON object. And now lastly, if I wanted to update the text content of the message element, and I'm using the template literals, so those are backticks. Those are right next to the 1 key on your keyboard or on most keyboards. And then using the $sign and the curly brackets to indicate that this is a variable value that we want to return back. We're taking the value of first, and then we'll also add the last name as well into the list. And I'll just put a dash there to separate them. So now we should have the output of all of the users that are contained within the JSON file being output into our web page. So let me make a quick update to this. So if there are any updates to it, and that will automatically, when the page reloads, that will update the content that's being returned back from the JSON file, and as well update the content within your web page. So go ahead and try this out. Create a more complex JSON object and have an array. And remember, comma separated out. And within the array, these are all objects. So they are comma separated between the objects. So they get a different index value within the array. Pull the information back into your web application and then extract the information that was contained within the JSON object and finally output it onto your web page. And you can be ready to move on to the next lesson.